Thanks for the kind invitation, and it's great to meet you all. Yeah, and I'm excited to share what I'm working on. So I'm assuming that many of you are familiar with network science in general, obviously. So I work on a very specialized and in some ways more general version, which is higher order networks. And what I want to talk about today is I want to talk about how current models and measures are inadequate in some ways to describe these higher order networks. So I know that many of you are familiar with all of this terminology, but I want to kind of frame how I think about this. And so I start from complex systems where it's just super general and it's a system that's composed of many components and they've got interactions between each other. And because this is so general, we need to make certain choices on how we represent complex systems. And of course, many of you are familiar with pairwise networks, where we make the assumption that two entities in the system interact at once, and we get these nodes and edges. But what I work on is a more general version, which are known as hypergraphs, or more generally, higher order networks. And this, again, has a set of entities or nodes, as you see in this diagram here. But then we also have a collection of arbitrarily sized interactions, where an M hyperedge is a interaction between M entities in that system. And so we see here we've got some 3 hyperedges, some 4 hyperedges, and then links, which are 2 hyperedges. So that kind of gives you the overall flavor of what I'll be talking about. But I want to motivate why higher order, because in some cases it's enough to simply say, I've got a pairwise network and some structure or dynamics on top of that. And so I think about it mostly from a dynamical systems perspective because I did my doctorate studying contagion processes on higher order networks. And so I'll give you 2 motivations. First is more from the social behavior side. So it's been empirically observed in systems that you can see tipping point behavior, where if you have a critical mass of people, as illustrated in this figure here, you'll get an epidemic, which is all these lighter colored lines here. But if I'm below that critical mass, the epidemic will die out. So we can think of that as a kind of social behavior motivation for why higher order networks are necessary. I will comment that you can get something like this bistable behavior, but it'll be for more complicated models, typically on pairwise networks. And this right here is a simple SIS model. So then more on the epidemiological side of things, there's this paper that I really like. It's the Universal Nonlinear Infection Kernel from Heterogeneous Exposure on Higher Order Networks. And in a nutshell, what these authors show is that if you have a threshold of, say, viral load at which you can get infected, so for instance, we see this diagram on the bottom here. They require a critical dose to get infected. And then if you kind of pair that with bursty interaction patterns, which are simply exponentially distributed durations of contact, then if you put those together, you can get a non-linear infection kernel. And that indicates that there's a nonlinear dependence on the infectivity and the size of interaction. So I want to talk about the terminology I'll use in this talk. And so being network scientists, you're probably familiar with the concept of degree as simply the number of neighbors to which a node is connected. And I look at an extension of this idea known as the hyperdegree. And that's just a vector where each entry in that vector indicates how many groups of a certain size that node is a part of. So for example, we see in this box right here, we see that this particular node is connected to 2 links and 1 3-way interaction. I'll be calling those triangles. And you may be familiar, but a hypergraph that has a single size, so size M hyperedges, that's known as a uniform hypergraph. okay? And if I've got a hyperedge or interaction that is not contained by any other edge, it's called a maximal edge. And I'll be referring to that a little bit later. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about simplicial complexes. You may be familiar with simplicial complexes more from the abstract setting, but I'm going to be taking a more of a data science perspective here. And the way I think about it is that if I have a simplicial complex, it's simply a hypergraph that has an added constraint. So it's a special case of a hypergraph that also satisfies what's known as downward closure. So if I've got an interaction, every sub-interaction must also exist. So for example, we've got this interaction 1, 2, 3, and that necessitates that 1, 2, 1, 3, and 2, 3 also exist. And if we're being absolutely strict, the interaction 1, 2, and 3 should also be included. Now, if I delete some of those interactions underneath 1, 2, and 3, it's no longer a simplicial complex. So this is kind of giving you, it's setting the scene for the talk. So does anyone have any questions so far as terminology? Okay, so I'm going to keep going. And a collaborator of mine said this once, and it really stuck with me, that really structurally what's interesting and differentiates higher order networks from pairwise networks is now interactions have non-trivial sizes. They're not just size 2. And in addition, they can overlap with one another in non-trivial ways, because for pairwise interactions, they only overlap at a single node. And lastly, they can include one another. So in this talk, I'll mostly be talking about the first and last of these considerations. So because hyperedges can have size, it turns out that higher order data sets just naturally encode different scales of interaction. So if I look at this diagram in the upper right here, what I've done is I've basically parsed out this hypergraph by its size. So on the first layer here, we have pairwise interactions, then triangle interactions, and so on and so forth. And so the basic hypothesis here is typically for networks, we'll look at an aggregate measure, say a sortativity. People also do this for higher order networks. But the thing is, they may aggregate connection patterns that could exist at certain scales only. And secondly, I mentioned that hyperedges can include one another in contrast to pairwise networks. So we see an illustration of this on the bottom right, where we've got a 4-way interaction that includes a 3-way interaction. And so what I'll be talking about today is that a hypergraph can be more or less like a simplicial complex. And I'll talk about what that means in a little bit. So to illustrate the first of these concerns, I'm going to introduce a project that's in collaboration with some folks from Pacific Northwest National Lab. It was recently published in February. And the basic question that we're trying to address is, how do the interaction patterns of a complex system vary across different scales of interaction? So the framework that we introduce is around the idea of filtering hypergraphs. And so if I've got a hypergraph H as a collection of vertices or nodes and hyperedges E, what we're going to do is we are going to preserve the same node set V, and we're going to look at a subset of these edges. And the particular subset that we consider is a size-dependent filtering. So you basically look at all the edges that satisfy a comparison operator between the size of the edges, that's that E bar there, asterisk K. Now, K is the filtering parameter that controls what size of interaction we want to look for. And then star is a comparison operator. Think like equality, greater than or equal to, etc. You can be more creative with this as well. So we, in this paper, basically consider 4 different filtering types. And so, for example, the uniform filtering, that basically extracts all of the uniform hypergraphs of the main hypergraph. So to illustrate this with a toy example, we get this. So on the left side, this is my original data set. And as I move from left to right in this grid, I am increasing that filtering parameter k. And so if I look at the top row, that is all the uniform hypergraphs, as I said before. So in the first column, I'm extracting all of the pairwise interactions. And then I'm extracting all the triangle interactions and so forth. Now for that second row there, what I'm doing is I'm gradually excluding larger and larger interaction sizes. So in that first column there, I've got all of my interactions. And in the next column, I'm excluding the links. And then the next one, I'm excluding the triangles and so forth. And then I'm actually doing the reverse in that third row there. I'm including greater and greater sized hyper edges. So first I just have links, and then I have links and triangles and so on. And then lastly, this exclusion operator is a useful tool to figure out, okay, if I remove an interaction size that's maybe anomalous or we think skews the results a lot, that can be a useful tool for isolating some other structure. So for example, in the first column there, I've excluded all of the links. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay. So I'm going to kind of illustrate this approach with a case study. We use the email Enron dataset. And if you're unfamiliar with this dataset, I think it was around the early 2000s, this company called Enron basically went bankrupt. It turned out that their executives were cooking the books. A bunch of them were indicted on fraud. But an interesting upshot of that was that we got access to their emails. And people turned this into a data set where email addresses are nodes and email messages between these email addresses are hyper edges. And so for simplicity, we cleaned this data set. So that means removing isolated nodes, removing multi-edges and singletons. I want to comment that a lot of our results are qualitatively the same. It's just they change quantitatively. And our minimum and maximum interaction sizes were 2 and 18, respectively. So we do this to explore 3 different types of structure. And what I want you to take away from this is that structure changes over different scales. So first we look at the degree assortativity, which if you're unfamiliar with this, this is simply the tendency of nodes with similar degrees to connect with one another. And so what I want you to notice is that for the top row here, we've got the uniform and greater than or equal to filtering. And if I look at the top 2 assortativity, that blue line there, it seems to be most assortative for edge sizes 5 through 8, just as a rule of thumb. And we can be more precise here, but I just want to illustrate the general trends that we're noticing. And in addition, if I look at the bottom right there, that exclusion filtering, it seems like when we exclude the pairwise interactions, that drastically affects the top-bottom assortativity, that purple curve at the bottom there. So it seems to indicate that pairwise interactions have the greatest effect on the assortativity. So secondly, we look at the betweenness centrality. And if you're unfamiliar with that, just as a general rule, measures nodes that have the greatest number of shortest paths that pass through them. And so we can glean 2 insights from this data set. First, this guy named Bill Williams, he's node 137. It turns out that he participates in many emails involving just one sender and one recipient, which we see right there. But it turns out that he's also involved in many lower order connections, as we see in this top right panel here. It continues to be a very central node, and also down here as well. So by and large, he might be the most central node if you average across scales. What's also interesting is that the CEO of the company seems to serve as an important intermediary when we're looking at emails of intermediate sizes, as illustrated with this region in the GEQ filtering. So I just want to emphasize that we could not get to these particular insights if we just looked at the data set as a whole. And so this offers us a tool to kind of get at some finer scale insights. And then the last structural property that I want to talk about is community structure. And many of you are familiar with this. I'm not doing a super complicated method for inferring the communities. We basically do spectral clustering on the hypergraph, on the projected hypergraph, excuse me. And we assign community labels to each node for different filterings. And so I want you to take away three different insights from this data set. So first, when I look at the bottom left here, as I include larger and larger interaction sizes, it seems like groups of nodes can switch their memberships, excuse me. See, like, for instance, these purple nodes here, some nodes in this region, and some nodes over here. Secondly, it seems like if I look at the greater than or equal to filtering, remember that's excluding larger and larger interaction sizes. It seems like certain nodes fail to join groups of a given size or larger, which we see illustrated with the white patches in that heat map. And then lastly, if I look at the bottom right here, this is the exclusion filtering. Recall, I'm just excluding a single interaction size. And what you should notice here is that certain nodes will flip their communities if you exclude a certain interaction size. So this just gives you some general insights as far as the things we can learn at different scales of interaction. So now would be a good time if anyone has any questions about this particular framework. I'd be happy to answer those. Any questions, or I'll keep moving on. Great. So the second thing was we said that edges can now include one another. And I argued that data sets may be more or less like a simplicial complex. And this is in collaboration with Jean-Gabriel Young, my postdoctoral advisor. He actually was here 3 weeks ago. So I guess I'm representing Vermont yet again. And also Nicole Eichmeyer. And just as an illustration here, we see on the left-hand side, this is a hypergraph. And we illustrate that if I add these missing edges, these missing sub-interactions, then I create on the right a simplicial complex. So why am I interested in this? And by the way, this was published last month in EPJ Data Science if you want to check it out. So it turns out that for many generative models in the literature, it is all or nothing. You've got models that are simplicial just by design. They enforce downward closure. Think of like the simplicial configuration model. And then on the other hand, we've also got models that have no consideration for the inclusion structure. And any thing that resembles a simplicial complex would be by accident as an artifact of that model. So think of the hypergraph Erdős-Rényi model. But our hypothesis was that simpliciality is likely a spectrum. So to do that, we first need to talk about what we mean by simplicial. And so we introduce simpliciality as a measure that takes a hypergraph and it maps it to the interval 0, 1. And it should increase as you add subfaces to a hypergraph as you become more like a simplicial complex. And by definition, a simplicial complex should be maximal because all of its subfaces are included. So notice that on this spectrum here, I've got a hypergraph that has none of its subfaces in it. And then on the right-hand side, we see a simplicial complex that has all of its subinteractions. So I just want to make some notes about this before we keep going. And that is that if you're familiar with simplicial complexes, specifically abstract simplicial complexes, people will typically include the empty set and singleton edges. What's kind of a problem is that some data sets just don't include singletons at all. So think of proximity data sets where you register a signal when two people are within a certain proximity of each other. Just by definition, there won't be any singleton edges, and therefore it can never be a simplicial complex. So we get around that by defining a minimum face size that a simplex contains. So instead of including singletons, we just say from the get-go, we exclude the singletons because they can't exist. The second thing that I want to talk about is that finding simplices can be super expensive. It turns out that the number of subfaces that an edge of size S includes is order 2 to the S, so it explodes combinatorially. And it turned out that this project had to develop a algorithmic component to simply measure some of these properties. And then lastly, just by definition, um, historically, edges of minimal size are simplices. But the problem is if I've got two hypergraphs that are the same with the caveat that one has just way more minimal sized edges, they'll have very different values for simpliciality, just because these minimal edges will skew that distribution. So what we do is we actually explicitly say we exclude those edges and we just focus on the edges for which inclusion is possible. So just to kind of orient you to some of the historical literature out there, there actually is not a lot when talking about simplicial complexes explicitly, but some folks who do are a group at Pacific Northwest National Lab, where they define the fraction of non-maximal edges, so included edges, that is known as inclusiveness. And then it turns out that there's a lot of literature in ecology on the nestedness of a network. And that's simply measuring the packing of the adjacency or incidence matrix entries. So if I look at the top right of this slide here, on the left side, that is the most packed or nested network. And as I move from left to right, I get less nested. And then in work last year, Tim Laroque and Renaud Lamiot defined the encapsulation matrix or encapsulation graph as a directed acyclical graph that basically measures inclusion relationships. So we've got a directed edge between edge I and edge J if edge I includes edge J. So that's kind of the background, and I just want to quickly walk you through how we measure simpliciality. So first, we define the simplicial fraction, which is the fraction of edges that are simplices. Now, again, recall that I exclude the ineligible simplices or the simplices of minimal size when I make this calculation. And so look at, we've got an edge of size, two edges of size 3. One of them is a simplex because it includes all of its subfaces. One is not. Then I've got an edge of size 4 that is not as well. So for example, the simplicial fraction of this is 1/3 because one of the 3 edges is a simplex. So then the second measure that we consider is known as the edit simpliciality. And the way you can think about this, kind of to bring back my prior illustration, is we want to know how many edges, the minimal number of edges that I need to add to make a hypergraph a simplicial complex. So that number is the simplicial edit distance, which is simply the number of edges in that simplicial complex minus the number of edges in my original hypergraph. And I can normalize that by the number of edges in the simplicial complex. And we use that to define the edit simpliciality, which is simply the number of edges in the hypergraph divided by the number of edges in my simplicial complex. Okay. And lastly, we define the face edit simpliciality, which is almost identical to that edit simpliciality, but now we define it as an average over faces. So the face edit distance is related to the average minimal number of subfaces I need to add to make an edge a simplex. So any questions so far about, oh yeah, I see a hand.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to understand the edit
Yeah,
simpliciality.
yeah, please.
Are you talking about the number of hyperedges you need to change, or the number of projected edges that you need to change?
Great question. So it's the number of edges. So for instance, if I've got this hypergraph right here, I need to add 2 links right here to make this a simplex, and so on and so forth. I need to add some triangles and an edge right here. Does that answer your question though?
Yeah, it does. So it seems like you're kind of building in this weighing of, like, say I have a fourth order hyperedge, that the third order face of that is being weighted more in this edit distance than like the second order.
Right. Yeah, so if I've got a larger edge, there will be combinatorially like, yeah, so many subfaces that you'll need to add. So there is some like weighting involved there. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. And so lastly, yeah, just on paper, the face edit distance is the minimal number of subfaces on average needed to make an edge a simplex. So it's very related to that edit simpliciality. And so I just want to talk briefly about pros and cons of these different measures. These are just self-defined measures. I assume that y'all could come up with more principled versions of these eventually, but this is a good starting point, I think. So for the simplicial fraction, a pro is that it measures a binary version of the quantity that we're interested in. So the problem, though, is that it doesn't count edges that are almost downward closed. Suppose I've got this giant edge of size 100, and I'm missing one link near the bottom. That means that it simply cannot be a simplex, even though it's got 99.999% of its subfaces. The other problem is that it's recursive by nature. So if I've got a simplex of size 10, for example, that necessitates that I've got combinatorially many simplices below it. Okay. For the edit simpliciality, it can be very explainable. It's just the number of edges I need to add to make a simplicial complex. The problem is it's a global metric, and you're often normalizing by a huge number if I've got large faces. And then lastly, for the face edit simpliciality, we've kind of fixed some of the dividing by a large number. But unfortunately, it doesn't often correlate to the actual number of simplices. And it's a little bit less explainable, I think, than the edit simpliciality. Okay. So I want to walk you through the data sets that we use. And so we consider 4 basic categories. First are the proximity data sets, where nodes are people who are wearing RFID badges. And if they get close to one another at a given time, then you'll have a link form between them. And if I have at the same time cliques between a group of people, I convert those cliques into a hyper edge. Okay. And so these data sets are in the high school, in a primary school, and in a hospital. And I briefly talked about email data sets with the email enron. And this is basically where nodes are email addresses and edges are email messages between those addresses. Thirdly, we've got biologically associated data sets that are just co-occurrences between biological substances or properties. So for instance, here I've got the diseaseome, where I've got diseases correlated with symptoms. DisGeneNet, which correlates genes and their diseases. And then lastly, compounds that form drugs. And then fourthly, we've got miscellaneous, which we've got Congress bills, which is Congress people and the bills that they co-sponsor in the US legislature. And then lastly, we've got this tags Ask Ubuntu data set where I've got a question that's been posted. That's an edge. And then the tags that people put on them are nodes. So what I want you to do is recall that a data set with more of their included subfaces is more simplicial. And so I want to ask you, what do you think of these categories? What do you think is the most simplicial?
You mean from all the possible combinations? I mean, from each of this category?
Yeah.
And from each of the subcategory?
Yeah, what do you think, what category do you think is the most simplicial?
I would go for emails.
Emails. Okay, great guess. So I'm going to reveal the results. It turns out that email is a second place, but that is an interesting data set that I'll talk about in a second. It turns out that proximity is by far the most simplicial. And what's interesting about this is I think it has something to do with the density. These are extremely dense networks. Every 20 seconds, you get a ping between these badges. And so I think it's just because of the sheer density that these are the most simplicial. In addition, the email is a super interesting example. It turns out to be, when you measure it with the simplicial fraction, it's actually highly simplicial. But when you measure it with the edit simpliciality, it's actually not so much. And so what's going on there is I kind of mentioned there's some biases that are introduced when we've got super large edges because you need a combinatorially large number of subfaces. And so what's happening with the edit simpliciality is that those large edges are driving the simpliciality to 0. And we don't get that same problem for the simplicial fraction and the face edit simpliciality. So these are actually highly simplicial data sets, but with these weird anomalies of large edges. For the biologically associated data sets, they turn out to not be so simplicial. This may be due to density or other pathologies of those particular data sets. And then lastly, if I look at the miscellaneous data sets, maybe Congress bills acts a little bit more like these biologically associated data sets, very not simplicial as much. And then the tags Ask Ubuntu seem to have some of the same characteristics as the email data sets. So more work can be done here, but it was nice to measure it and kind of see where data sets fall on this spectrum, where 0 is least simplicial and 1 is most. So I argued at the beginning that generative models just fail to capture this property. We did not consider exhaustive examples of generative models, but we did consider generative models that researchers often use to fit empirical data sets. So first, we looked at the bipartite SBM, where it not only includes degree and edge size sequences, but also the community structure as well. Secondly, we looked at the configuration model, where we exactly match degree and edge size sequences. And then thirdly, we have the bipartite Chung-Lu model, where we match degree and edge size and expectation. So the question is, so if I take 1,000 realizations of each of these fitted models, how well do they capture simpliciality? And the answer is not well, in my opinion. So whenever you've got a non-trivial value of simpliciality, it seems like our models fail to capture those values. So for example, here, we've got the empirical values with these gray circles. And for the configuration Chung-Lewin bipartite SVM, they just fail to capture this value. It seems like for edit simpliciality, the configuration model definitely does better, but it still does not fully capture the simpliciality. So that indicates to me that there's a lot of exciting opportunities here to develop models that can actually capture these latent parameters. So lastly, I'd like to leave you with local simpliciality as a measure of how simpliciality is distributed on a given network. So we define the local simpliciality of node V as the simpliciality of its ego hypergraph. So I take a node, I look at all of its neighbors, and the induced hypergraph on that, I look at the simpliciality of that. And so looking at this diagram here, gray indicates a NaN value. Think of that just being all of its neighborhood were minimal faces, so you can't really compute the simpliciality as I defined before. And we can see that depending on my definition, it's distributed differently across the network. So you shouldn't be expected to look at this hairball and decipher how simpliciality is distributed. So what we actually look at is a measure of simplicial assortativity. Okay, and what is that? It's, think of just degree assortativity, but now we plug in simpliciality. And we define it across links, where links are the projected network. So A sub ij is 1 when we've got a link between I and j, or it's connected via some combination of hyper edges, and 0 otherwise. And so we look at the Pearson correlation coefficient between the simpliciality values to compute this simplicial assortativity. And if we do that, we get this basic set here, which we've got 3 different measures of simpliciality. So we have 3 different measures of simplicial assortativity. And I just want you to notice that there are varying degrees of simpliciality. So for hospitals, we see slightly negative or 0 values of simplicial assortativity. So it's basically uncorrelated. But for some like NDC substances or Congress bills, they're very correlated. So simplicial neighborhoods are very correlated with one another. Yeah, so I just want to wrap up and leave you with this. Hopefully I've convinced you that we don't have adequate models to represent some of these properties. First off, we cannot model structure, or sorry, we can't measure structure at different scales with some of the like global level metrics. And in addition, it seems like with our current generative models, we cannot match the empirical simpliciality. And one more comment that I want to make is I had a paper out in 2022 measuring the assortativity of hypergraphs. And we did some like rewiring to change the assortativity, keeping the degree sequence constant. And what I want to comment here is that with this box right here, we see this discontinuous jump. And that seems to indicate that assortativity plus the degree sequence can't fully capture the spreading properties, aka the eigenvalue of a hypergraph. So it seems like there's a lot of work that can be done to capture some of this latent structure. So with that, here are some publications corresponding with this. I mentioned 2 of these papers came out this year. And then XGI kind of was the software package to operationalize all of this. It's out in JOS. And so with that, I would be happy to take any questions. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Nicolas.